Early African Civilizations, Egypt, Social Science, Section 3. Geographical background of Egypt. Historians consider the invention of agriculture, which increased and stabilized the human food supply, as the starting point for urban civilization. By requiring people to remain in one place for the duration of a growing season, farming led humans to settle in one place, construct durable housing, and accumulate possessions. By making land valuable, farming triggered disputes that led to the creation of laws and government. By increasing the amount of available food, farming promoted trade and allowed societies to pay for specialized professions such as priests, toolmakers, governors, and military leaders. Coincidentally, because all of these activities produced increasing numbers of objects and records, historians have found it much easier to learn about urban civilizations than earlier hunter-gatherer groups. The earliest evidence of farming was found in southwestern Asia and dates from about 10,000 BCE. By roughly 3000 BCE, there were urban civilizations located along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in present-day Iraq, and along the Nile River in modern Egypt. In Egypt, humans organized to take advantage of the annual river floods, which resulted when the Central African rainy season poured large amounts of water into the Nile's three major tributaries: the Blue Nile and the Atbara River from Ethiopia, and the White Nile River from the region that includes present-day Kenya and Uganda. As they flowed north, the floods eroded the land through which they passed, and carried the resulting sediment, called silt, to Egypt, depositing it along the Nile River's banks. With plenty of water and sunshine, plus fresh soil every year, Egyptian farming was some of the most productive in the ancient world, able to support large populations and produce surpluses that paid for buildings, art, education, and government. The Nile Valley has three distinct regions. At the mouth of the river is the Nile Delta, known in ancient history as Lower Egypt. It is a low, flat area that is prone to flooding and which contains some of the best soil in Africa, thanks to the annual floods. To reach the delta, the Nile flows through a long channel that winds between sandstone cliffs and narrow floodplains, through a region known in ancient history as Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt ended at the first of six major rapids known as cataracts, and beyond that was the land called Nubia by the Egyptians. Early history and the Old Kingdom. At first, there were many small communities along the Nile River, but as the Sahara Desert dried out, population pressures along the river may have led to warfare and centralization. A carved stone tablet known as the Palette of Narmer contains images that led historians to conclude that Upper Egypt, led by Medes, conquered Lower Egypt. The result was Egypt's first centralized government, called the Old Kingdom, which formed around 2686 BCE. During this period, strong pharaohs exerted highly centralized authority over peasants, using local nobles to transmit their orders from the capital at Memphis, near modern-day Cairo, on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. The evidence for the power of the pharaohs comes from the major archaeological finds of this period, the Great Pyramids. A pyramid is a large structure that served as a tomb for a pharaoh. It was constructed from blocks of stone, weighing several tons each, that were brought to the construction site from elsewhere in the Nile Valley. The pyramids were not built in the valley itself. That would have taken too much valuable farmland, but on the plateau, overlooking the valley at the edge of the desert. In a period when there were no machines for moving heavy loads, all of this had to be done using human muscle power. The largest pyramid of all, Cheops, required humans to lift stone blocks to a height of more than 400 feet. The labor to do this came from Egyptian farmers, and it had to occur when the farmers were not busy farming, most likely during the flooding season. The Nile floods begin at Cairo about June and reach their maximum in September, during the hottest time of year in Egypt. It must have been difficult to keep farmers at work moving heavy stone blocks, and it must have also required extensive organization to provide food, water, and housing for a workforce that probably numbered in the tens of thousands. All of this leads historians to conclude that the leaders of Old Kingdom Egypt possessed extensive power and the means to control a large number of people. Pharaonic Egypt culture flowered greatly during the Old Kingdom and then retained much of its characteristic style for millennia afterward. Monumental building, for example, reached a peak in about 2600 to 2500 BCE, when some of the most impressive pyramids were constructed at Giza, and then continued over the next millennia. Other art styles that emerged early in the Old Kingdom continued to influence art produced as much as 2,000 years later. Egyptian religion and beliefs. Egyptian religion underwent modifications over time. Egyptians regarded the earliest pharaohs of the Old Kingdom as incarnations of the raven god Horus. Without quite giving up this claim, later pharaohs claimed to be god descendants of Ra, the sun god, or Osiris, the god ruler of the underworld. Historians believe that the original pharaohs came to rule over a country with a great deal of religious diversity, with each of the small original kingdoms having its own gods and local priesthoods. One way to reconcile them all might have been to establish an authoritative account that would show them as members of a common pantheon, where one god was supreme, but all found an honored place. Another solution that worked better for the central authorities was not to worry about the primacy among the gods, but to allow each group of priests to go on their way so as long as they recognized that the pharaoh himself was a god king incarnate on earth. Before the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian religion and a belief in an eternal life were concerns of the elite. Little was organized at the level of the peasants. During the Middle Kingdom, the priesthood expanded, and with the construction of temples, more Egyptians began to share the experience of faith, deities, and the possibilities of an afterlife. The New Kingdom pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, even attempted to place these new developments under the auspices of a single paramount god. A more communal religious experience was also expressed in perceptions of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh and those entombed with him could enter the afterlife. During the New Kingdom, however, the famous Book of the Dead appeared, which described how Egyptians generally could influence their own afterlives. The pharaoh was not merely a deity. His personal physical health was intimately associated with the land, the harvest, and especially with the supply of the water from the Nile flood. If the pharaoh became ill, the people expected a grim future, perhaps drought. The linkage of the health of the ruler to the fate of the people became a common in much of Africa and probably arose in various forms independently of Egypt through time to justify the rise of central authority over emerging societies. In terms of law, or ma'at, people considered the pharaohs divine instruments of the universe who symbolized and carried out truth, justice, order, and harmony. Societal organization and power in the Old Kingdom. Free peasant communities formed the base of Egyptian society, although some slaves also existed. During the Old Kingdom, which had its capital at Memphis, no important social group stood between the peasantry and the royal household. The entire organization of the country, including foreign trade and irrigation works, was in the hand of the royal household. Imagine such power. Peasants either had their labor taxed or they worked on irrigation projects and monumental architecture like the pyramids. Tens of thousands of people must have been mobilized each year during the dry season to supplement or replace those freed from agriculture during the flood season to create public works on the vast scale of those that remain. This was a testament to the organizational skills of the leadership of the Old Kingdom. After the first millennium of pharaonic rule, the royal household became less efficient. Perhaps it grew too big and weedly, or perhaps officials began to make their offices hereditary. In any case, the centralized kingdom broke down after about 2200 BCE, leading to the first intermediate period during which political authority was fragmented. Several local leaders claim to be the god king of all Egypt, though none of them can make that claim stand. The Middle Kingdom and the beginnings of contact with the outside world. Then, after 2055 BCE, centralized authority was restored with the foundation of the Middle Kingdom, but the rise of local power, which had begun during the first intermediate period, remained. Landlords and local priests, the new gentry, became an important intermediate group between the peasantry and the royal household. Egypt also was no longer as isolated by the surrounding deserts. Pharaohs had already sent Egyptian naval expeditions down the Red Sea to southern Arabia, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa at the end of the Old Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, the naval expeditions became more organized and frequent. Increased trade by the sea in the Levant, the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and overland contact with the Fertile Crescent also made pharaonic Egypt less isolated than it had been previously. Up the Nile, several kingdoms of Nubia had existed during the Old Kingdom. Parts of Nubia probably fell under Egyptian rule even before 2000 BCE. The first Nubian kingdoms were likely similar to Egypt itself, with divine rule associated with rain, soil fertility, and nature generally. Later on, during the New Kingdom, Nubians adopted Egyptian gods in hieroglyphic writing. Although not constant, the expansion of Egyptian culture into sub-Saharan Africa continued on for centuries. Egypt's contact with the outer world further increased during the Second Intermediate Period with the invasion of the Hyksos. Historians are divided as to just who the Hyksos were. One possibility is that they were chariot-riding warriors who swept down and conquered Egypt, as similar charioteers had recently conquered Mesopotamia. Yet they also could have been simply immigrants from Asia who infiltrated and then rose more slowly to power within Egypt. In any event, the Hyksos ruled most of the Nile Delta while native Egyptians continued to rule over Upper Egypt. Whatever their political role, the Hyksos brought new Asian influences and technologies, including military chariots, bronze metallurgy, textile manufacturers, musical instruments, olive trees, and new breeds of cattle. The New Kingdom and the end of ancient Egyptian civilization. The New Kingdom began after about 1550 BCE, when an Egyptian dynasty reunited Egypt. Although the Hyksos may have assimilated into the Egyptian population, increased foreign contact continued. Several Egyptian armies invaded the Fertile Crescent. After 1500 BCE, Egypt seemed on the verge of uniting all urban societies of the Middle East, much as Rome later united the Mediterranean world. At some period in the New Kingdom, Egypt did succeed in ruling Nubia almost as far as the rainfall region of what is now South Sudan. The growing power of other states, however, thwarted Egypt's expansion. After 1069 BCE, a series of Asian powers succeeded each other as rulers in Egypt. The Hittites from Anatolia, then the Assyrians, and finally the Persians conquered Egypt. In 332 BCE, Alexander of Macedonia brought Egypt under his rule. Other foreigners founded Egyptian dynasties, including Libyans from the west and Egyptianized Nubians from the south. Well before the end of the New Kingdom, foreign elements had strongly influenced Egyptian life and art. Iron metallurgy came in from Anatolia. Thus, even before the Ptolemaic rule of Egypt, foreign cultures had already paved the way for Greek influences that would pull Egypt into the intercommunicating Hellenistic world of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. After approximately 2,000 years, the relative stability, isolation, power, and creative glory of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms of Pharaonic Egypt had passed.